Welcome, brethren, to another edition of my weekly pastor's comments. And this morning we're going to be looking at Psalm 50, and it addresses a topic that is important to each and every one of us, or addresses the topic of worship. You see, these believers, these people of God, had come to worship God in rote and ritual, and their heart just wasn't in it. And God addresses that issue, and in Psalm 50, it's a picture of God as judge. In verses 1 through 6, he's a judge that comes to look at his people's worship. And just like the book of Hebrews, Psalm 3 says, our God is a consuming fire, and he's ready to judge and rebuke them for their heartless worship. And he comes and condemns his people. And he calls the nations, and he calls the earth, and he calls the heavens as witnesses to what he's going to say. And he tells the people, "Hear, O Israel, when I speak," in verse 7, "I will testify against you." But it's interesting that he doesn't reprove them in verse 8 for their burnt offerings and their sacrifices. They're doing the right things in the right way. What he addresses is their hearts, because they ultimately believed that God needed their sacrifices. They accept the worldly mindset, like the pagan gods, that the gods needed the sacrifices. They need to feed the sacrifices to the gods, the pagan gods. Well, God says, I don't need those things. I don't want those things with the wrong heart. He said, I have the cattle on 1,000 hills. So he rebukes them and says, I don't need those things. What he really wants, he says in verse 14, is for them to offer to God a sacrifice of thanksgiving and pay your vows to the Most High. Call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will rescue you, and you will honor me. God wanted them. He wanted their devotion. And that's what he wanted, a wholehearted devotion to them, and not just their mindless and ritualistic sacrifices. Well, God wanted them to acknowledge that they needed him, to humble themselves, and to recognize his provision and his protection, that all good things come from him, and to worship him as a response to his character and his work. Brother, when we worship God, we worship him, and we should worship him in spirit and in truth. Jesus Christ is the truth, and no one can come to the Father except through him. There's no other name on this earth which men can be saved. It's Jesus Christ. Brethren, worship the Lord wholeheartedly. Recognize him alone as your protector and your provider, and humble yourselves before him with the right heart. God bless.